Some men spend their whole lives building something worth respecting. Quincy Marsh spent 40 years running into burning buildings in Houston while other people ran out. He pulled children from fires. He lost men he loved on the job. He buried friends in full dress uniform and then went back to work the next shift because that was what the job required. His community called him a hero, and they meant it. Then he retired, flew to the Philippines, and met a receptionist from Cebu named Roxanne Santos. And in less time than it took him to build his reputation, he watched $420,000 turn it into a story people told as a warning. This is how a hero becomes a cautionary tale, and what he learned about himself that he couldn't have learned any other way. The thing about being a fire chief for 20 of my 40 years on the job is that people look at you a certain way. Not with awe exactly. The men under me would have laughed at the word awe, but with a kind of settled respect that becomes, over time, part of how you understand yourself. I was Quincy Marsh, Fire Chief, Houston Station 14. I knew what that meant in the neighborhood. I knew what it meant when I walked into a diner and the owner waved off my money. I knew what it meant at the 4th of July parade when the kids pointed and the parents leaned down and said something. I had earned that. Every scar on my hands was a receipt. I retired at 68 with a pension, a plaque from the mayor, and a farewell barbecue at the station that lasted until 2 in the morning and left me feeling both complete and hollowed out in a way I hadn't anticipated. My wife Sandra had passed 4 years before, heart failure, the kind that goes fast, which is merciful and devastating in equal measure. My son Derek lived in Dallas with his wife and 2 kids. My daughter Patrice was in Atlanta, doing well in hospital administration, calling every Sunday without fail since her mother died. The house in the Heights felt different after the retirement than it had after Sandra. When Sandra died, I had the job. The job is very good at filling the space that grief leaves. You have somewhere to be. You have people who need you to be your best self because their lives depend on it. That structure holds you up whether you want it to or not. When the job ended too, there was no structure left to hold up anything. I did what men like me do. I stayed busy. I volunteered with the local fire safety education program. I went to Derek's for Thanksgiving and Patrice's for Christmas. I took up woodworking in the garage with moderate success and significant sawdust. I had friends for the job who checked in and the occasional beer at a bar where people still recognized me. But the evenings were long and the house was quiet. And after 68 years of being useful to people, being not useful is a very specific kind of pain that woodworking in a garage only partially addresses. My buddy Clarence, retired EMT, best man at my wedding, the kind of friend you call at 3 in the morning when things go bad, suggested the Philippines. He'd been once, 3 years prior, for 2 weeks with a group from his church. He said the people were warm, and the weather was warm, and the food was good, and he'd felt something there he hadn't felt in a while. He said, "Quincy, you need warm. You've been standing in cold rooms for too long." He wasn't wrong. I booked a 3-week trip to Cebu in February, because Cebu had beaches and I hadn't seen a beach in 4 years, and I figured if nothing else I'd come back with a tan and some stories. I came back with something considerably more complicated than either. The hotel where I stayed in Cebu was modest and clean. I'm not a luxury man, never have been. The fire service doesn't build that instinct. The lobby was small and bright, and the woman at the reception desk, when I checked in on a Tuesday afternoon, had the kind of smile that makes you feel like your arrival was the best thing that had happened to the building all day. Her name was Roxanne. She was 33. She had dark hair pulled back neatly and a uniform that was pressed with the care that people press things when they take their work seriously, and she handled my check-in with a mixture of efficiency and warmth that is rarer than it should be. She asked if it was my first time in Cebu. I said it was. She gave me 2 recommendations: a restaurant near the waterfront and a viewpoint outside the city that she said most tourists missed. Without being asked, the way someone gives a recommendation when they genuinely want the person to have a good experience, rather than because it's in a script. I went to the restaurant that evening. The food was exactly as good as she'd said. I stopped by the desk the next morning to tell her so. She laughed, a real laugh, not a hospitality laugh, and said she was glad and asked how I'd slept. We talked for 10 minutes about nothing in particular. I came back through the lobby that afternoon on my way out, and we talked for another 10 minutes. By the end of the first week, it had become something I was organizing my days around, without quite admitting that was what I was doing. She was easy to talk to in the way that very few people are easy to talk to. She asked questions, and she listened to the answers, and she remembered them and built on them in the next conversation. She asked about the fire service with genuine curiosity, not the general interest questions that people ask when they want to seem interested, but specific questions that showed she'd been thinking about what I'd said before. She asked what it felt like to walk into a building that was on fire. She asked what the hardest part of the job was. She asked about Sandra in a way that was careful and respectful, and made it feel like asking about Sandra was the right thing to do rather than something to tiptoe around. I told her things I hadn't told many people. About the fire in 2003 where we lost 2 men. About the week after Sandra died when I went back to work 2 days early, because I couldn't be in the house. About what it meant to retire from a job that had been your identity for 40 years and find the identity gone when the job was. She listened to all of it. She said, one evening when we were sitting at the waterfront restaurant she'd recommended, and the evening had moved from a casual drink to something longer without either of us deciding that was what was happening. You've spent your whole life taking care of other people. Has anyone ever taken care of you? I didn't have a quick answer for that. Sandra had, in her way. But Sandra was 4 years gone, and the question landed in a space that had been empty for a while. Not recently, I said. She looked at me steadily across the table. You deserve that, she said. Someone who actually sees what you've given and gives something back. I was 71 years old, and I'd run into fires that had burned my hands, and I was sitting at a table in Cebu feeling like a man who had just been offered something he hadn't known he was hungry for. That was where it started. That was the crack in the wall. I extended my trip by 2 weeks. Then I went home and came back 6 weeks later. Cebu had changed in my head from a place I'd visited to a place I thought about. That distinction matters. It's the difference between a destination and a direction. The relationship with Roxanne deepened in the second visit in a way that felt inevitable rather than sudden. She was still at the hotel, still at the desk, and when I walked in, she looked up, and her face did something that I held on to for longer than I should have. We had dinner that first night, and it felt like a continuation of a conversation rather than a beginning of something, which is one of the ways you know you're in trouble. By the end of the second visit, I had told her clearly that I was developing real feelings for her. She said she felt the same. She said it without theatrics, quietly, with the kind of stillness that reads as genuine. She said she knew the situation was complicated, the age, the distance, the different worlds. She said she wasn't asking me for anything. She just wanted me to know that what she felt was real. I believed her. I believed her completely and without reservation. And the thing I've had to sit with since is that I'm not entirely sure she was lying in those early months. I think there was something real in her. I think the part that came later was layered over something that started genuine. That's actually harder to make peace with than if it had been performance all the way through. Clarence called me from Houston during the second visit. He asked how the trip was going. I told him about Roxanne in general terms. He was quiet for a moment and then said, Quincy, tell me you're being sensible. I'm always sensible, I said. That's not what I asked, Clarence. She's a receptionist at the hotel you're staying at, he said. I'm not saying anything about her character. I'm saying that's a situation that has patterns. People aren't patterns, I said. He was quiet again. Then no, they're not. Just be careful, brother. I thanked him and moved on, which is what you do when someone says something you don't want to think about. The first money came from a place that felt completely natural. Her mother had been sick, a real illness, a respiratory condition that I heard about gradually and in detail that felt lived in rather than constructed. The specialist in Cebu was expensive. The medication was not covered by her family's means. She mentioned it once, not as a request, or at least it was constructed so well that it didn't feel like a request. It felt like sharing something heavy. I gave her $3,500. This felt like a modest gesture. It felt like a man with means helping someone he cared about with a real problem. It felt like exactly the kind of thing a decent person does. She was grateful in a way that made the giving feel like the right thing. Not effusive, not performative. Quiet, genuine seeming gratitude of someone who doesn't ask for help easily and doesn't receive it lightly. I want to mark that moment carefully, not because $3,500 is a significant amount, but because the manner of it, the way the need was presented, the way the help was received, the way I felt afterward, established a template. I didn't know it was a template. It felt like a one-time response to a one-time situation. Over the next 8 months, I made 11 trips between Houston and Cebu. Each trip cost me money. Each trip also produced reasons to give money. Her mother's ongoing treatment. A leak in her family's home in a village outside the city that required structural repair. Her younger brother's college enrollment fees. A motorbike for her cousin who needed it to get to his job. Medical bills for her aunt. Each amount was explained in detail and context. Each amount was consistent with what the real cost of such things in the Philippines would be, which I could roughly estimate and which always fell within the range of plausibility. I didn't add them up. That's the honest accounting of it. I deliberately did not add them up because adding them up would have required looking at the total. And the total would have required asking a question I wasn't ready to ask. By the time Roxanne mentioned the business idea, a small restaurant cafe she wanted to open in Cebu, the kind of small entrepreneurial dream that would give her independence and a future, I was already somewhere north of $80,000 in without having clearly registered it. The restaurant made sense to me. It felt like something real, something productive, something I could point to and say, I'm building something for this person, not just funding a problem. I gave her $45,000 for the initial fit-out, equipment, and the first 6 months of operating costs, as she projected them. She sent me photographs of the space, the renovation in progress, the equipment arriving. A photograph of herself in the half-finished kitchen looking proud and slightly overwhelmed. These photographs made me feel something I had felt in the fire service, the feeling of making a real difference to a real person's real life. That feeling was familiar and good, and I didn't examine it closely enough. The restaurant opened. It was real. She sent me videos. She had a small sign above the door. She called me on opening day, sounding genuinely moved. For about 4 months, she sent me updates, customer numbers, a good review someone had posted online, a new menu item that was popular. It seemed like the plan was working. Then the updates became less frequent, then sporadic. When I asked about the restaurant, she would answer, but the answers had less detail in them. When I visited in month 7, the restaurant was open but clearly struggling. Fewer tables occupied than the videos had suggested, the energy of a business that was contracting rather than growing. She said the market in that part of the city had changed. She said a competitor had opened nearby. She said she needed to adapt the concept, and that would require another injection to refit and remarket. I gave her $28,000. Patrice called me on a Sunday in October. Our regular call, but with something different in her voice from the first sentence. She said she'd been thinking about what I'd mentioned in the last few calls about giving Roxanne money for the business, and she wanted to ask me something directly. How much altogether, Dad? She said. Everything. Since you met her. I told her I wasn't sure of the exact number. Roughly, she said. I sat with the phone and looked at the ceiling of my kitchen in Houston and thought about what roughly meant and said a number that was less than what I knew the real number probably was. She was quiet long enough that I said, Patrice, Dad, she said, that number you just said. You know it's more than that. Maybe a little more, I said. How much more? I don't know the exact, Dad. How much more? I went to my laptop. I opened the banking app. I scrolled through the international transfers for the previous 22 months. I had never done this before in a single sitting with the intention of producing a total. The reason I had never done this is the same reason you don't look down when you're on a high ledge. The looking changes things. The total was $247,000 at that point, I told Patrice. The silence on the other end of the line was a particular kind of silence that I recognized from the fire service. The silence of someone processing information that is bad enough to require a moment before responding. Okay, she said, very carefully. Okay, Dad, I need you to listen to me. I listened. She said she wasn't judging me. She said she understood that what I felt for Roxanne was real, and that I wouldn't have done any of this for a person I didn't genuinely care about. She said she wasn't going to tell me what to do, but she said she needed to ask me, had I verified independently where any of this money had actually gone. The medical bills. Had I seen a statement from the hospital? The restaurant? Had I seen the lease, the registered business permit, the accounts? The renovation costs? Had I seen invoices? I had not seen any of these things. I had seen photographs, and I had seen the restaurant itself, and I had seen the emotional reality of a woman who appeared to be grateful and working hard and genuinely trying. But documents, actual paper trails that connected the money I sent to the expenses I was told it covered, I had never asked for and had never been offered. I need you to ask for them, Patrice said. Not because I think you're wrong about her as a person, but because $247,000 is enough money that you owe it to yourself to know what you're holding. I told her I would. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Roxanne. The conversation was the hardest one we'd had. I told her what Patrice had asked, and I told her that I agreed with Patrice. I said I needed to see documentation, receipts, hospital statements, the restaurant's registered paperwork, the invoices for the renovation and the equipment. I said I wasn't accusing her of anything. I said I should have asked earlier, and the asking was overdue on my side. She went quiet on the phone, not the thinking quiet of someone preparing an answer. A different kind of quiet. Then she said, "You don't trust me." "I trust you," I said. "I'm asking for documentation." "Those aren't the same thing." "After everything," she said. "After everything I've shared with you and everything you've meant to my family. You're asking me to prove myself." "I'm asking for receipts," I said. "That's not the same as asking you to prove yourself." "It feels the same," she said. "It feels exactly the same." I told her I was sorry it felt that way and that I still needed the documents. She said she'd see what she could gather and call me back. She did not call back that week. I called twice. She answered the second time and said she was working on pulling everything together. But it was taking time because things were not organized the way a Western businessman might organize them. I said I understood. I said I'd wait. I waited 2 more weeks. What came through at the end of those 2 weeks was a collection of photographs of documents, some of which, when I looked at them carefully, had the particular quality of documents that had been produced recently to look like they had been produced at various points in the past, dates that didn't match sequence, letterheads that were inconsistent with the institutions they claimed to represent, a hospital receipt that referred to treatment dates where I could cross-reference against something Roxanne had said during that period, and the dates didn't align with the timeline she had given me. I sent everything to Derek. He is a detail-oriented man. He works in logistics, and I asked him to look at it with fresh eyes. He called me back the next day and said carefully, "Dad, some of this doesn't hold up." I went back to Cebu one final time, not because I thought I was going to recover the money or confront anyone into confessing. I went because I needed to see it clearly with my own eyes. I needed to close the loop in the way that I had always closed loops, by being present, by being direct, by looking at the situation without a screen between me and it. I met Roxanne at the restaurant. It was open. The restaurant was real. She was there, and she was composed, and she looked at me with an expression that had shifted from what it used to be, something more careful in it, more measured, a watching quality that hadn't been there in the early months. I sat across from her and I put the documents on the table and I asked her, quietly and without anger, to explain the inconsistencies. She looked at the documents. She looked at me. Then she said, "Quincy, what do you want me to say?" "The truth," I said, "that's all. Just the truth about where the money went." She was quiet for a long time. The restaurant was half empty around us. Somewhere in the kitchen something was being prepared, and the smell of it was good and ordinary, and completely at odds with what was happening at our table. "Some of it went where I said it went," she said finally. "My mother was sick. That was real. The restaurant is real. And the rest," I said. She looked at her hands. "Family debts," she said quietly, "obligations I had before I met you. Things I couldn't explain without it seeming like that's why I was with you. And I didn't want you to think that's why I was with you." I sat with that. The particular honesty of a partial confession. The truth delivered in the shape that hurts least to give. "How much of what I sent you went to things you told me it was going to?" I asked. She didn't answer. The not answering was the answer. "Roxanne," I said, "I'm going to ask you one more time, and then I'm going to stand up and walk out of this restaurant, and we're not going to have this conversation again." She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, which could have meant several things. "Maybe half," she said. "Maybe half of $420,000. The total I had added up on the flight over had gone where she said it had gone. The other half had gone to family obligations, debts, possibly other things I would never fully account for, and was not coming back." I nodded. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me that much." I stood up. I put some money on the table for the coffees. I picked up the documents. I said, "I hope the restaurant does well. I mean that." She looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, Quincy." I believed her. That's the part I carry. I believe she was sorry. I believe there was something real in what she felt, coexisting with what she did. People are not one simple thing, and that complexity doesn't excuse anything, but it's the honest picture. I walked out of the restaurant into the Cebu afternoon and stood on the pavement and looked at the street for a moment. The city was loud and warm and going about its business. I was 71 years old, $420,000 lighter than I had been 2 years ago, and I was going to have to go home and tell the people who had called me a hero what that had cost me. Telling Clarence was the hardest conversation of the homecoming. Not because he said anything harsh, he didn't. Clarence sat across from me in my kitchen with 2 beers and let me talk through the whole thing from the beginning without interrupting once, which took nearly 2 hours. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Brother, I should have pushed harder." "You warned me," I said. "I said be careful," he said. "I should have said, let me help you think through this." I should have sat with you and asked the hard questions out loud instead of saying be careful and trusting you to figure it out alone. "I was a fire chief for 20 years, I said. "I've been making hard calls alone since before you knew me." "You have," he said. "And that's part of what happened. You're wired to make the decision and act. You're not wired to sit still and verify. The job trained the hesitation out of you. That hit something. I've thought about it many times since. The fire service rewards action. It rewards decisive movement toward the problem, not away from it. It rewards the men who run toward the building, not the men who stand outside it, asking whether the structural analysis supports entry. That wiring had kept me and my men alive for 40 years. In a different context, it had run me straight into a $420,000 loss, without pausing long enough to look at what I was running into. The story got around Houston. I don't know exactly how. These things move through communities the way smoke moves through a structure, finding every gap. Some people were kind about it, some people were not. A man at the barber shop, who had always greeted me with a certain warmth, greeted me differently once, and I understood what the difference was. A woman at the grocery store said something to her companion when she thought I was out of earshot, that I won't repeat here, but that I heard. I had gone from being the man the community pointed to with pride to being the man the community pointed to as a cautionary tale. That transition is its own kind of fire, and there is no training that prepares you for it. Derek came from Dallas 2 weeks after I got back. He didn't make a production of it, just drove up on a Saturday morning and stayed the weekend, and helped me go through the financial picture in the same careful, practical way he approaches his logistics work. He helped me understand what the damage actually meant for my retirement picture. The pension was intact, the house was paid, the overall position was changed but not catastrophic. He did not say anything that resembled "I told you so," which I noted and was grateful for. Patrice called every Sunday as she always had, and for the first month those calls were careful and tender in the way that calls are when someone is handling something fragile. Around the 5th Sunday she said, "Dad, can I say something without you thinking I'm piling on?" "Go ahead," I said. "You are still the man who ran into fires for 40 years, she said. "That's not gone because of this. You made a decision that cost you money and that cost you some pride. But the thing that made you run into fires, the caring about people, the willingness to give everything for someone in need, that's not a flaw. That's who you are. It just needed a better structure around it." I was quiet for a moment. "A better structure," I said. "Independent verification," she said. "Ask before you give. See the receipts. Talk to me or Derek before any amount over a certain threshold. Not because you can't be trusted. Because love makes us all a little blind, and having someone else's eyes on it isn't weakness. It's just sense." She was right. She has been right about most things since she was about 14, which is something I'm only now giving her proper credit for. I've been back in Houston for 6 months now. The woodworking has gotten better. I made Patrice's kids a set of wooden blocks that actually look like wooden blocks, and not like abstract art, which represents genuine progress. I've gone back to the fire safety education program with more hours than before, partly because it's useful, and partly because being useful is the thing I know best and have needed most. I spoke at a community event last month, not about the Philippines specifically, about judgment under pressure, which is something I know about from both ends now. I talked about the way that the skills that make you good in a crisis can become liabilities in a different kind of situation. I talked about the difference between decisive action and verified action. I talked about the fact that the same quality that makes a man run into a building, the certainty that the right thing to do is to go, to give, to help, can run him straight into the wrong place if he doesn't slow down long enough to make sure the building is what he thinks it is. People listened. Some of them nodded in ways that told me I wasn't the only one in the room who had run somewhere without looking carefully enough first. After the event, a younger man came up to me, maybe 50, solidly built, the look of someone who works with his hands. He said he was going to the Philippines next year to visit a woman he'd been talking to online for 6 months. He asked me what I thought. I told him I thought the Philippines was a beautiful country with good people in it, and that most of what he would find there was exactly what it presented itself as. I told him that the problems came not from the place or the people, but from the gap between what we want to believe and what we're willing to verify. I told him to ask for documentation before money moves. I told him to talk to someone he trusted, his kids, a friend, someone with no stake in the outcome, before any financial decision above a few $100s. I told him to slow down in proportion to the amount involved. He thanked me. He said he'd heard I used to be a fire chief. Still am in most of the ways that matter, I said. He nodded and walked away. I watched him go and thought about Roxanne in the Cebu restaurant saying she was sorry, and about Clarence in my kitchen saying he should have pushed harder, and about Patrice saying the caring isn't a flaw, it just needed a better structure. The $420,000 is gone. That's just the arithmetic of the thing. The reputation in Houston has taken a hit it may not fully recover from. And I've made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with a scar. Not by pretending it isn't there, but by understanding what it means about where you've been. What I've got instead is something I didn't expect to value as much as I do. A clearer picture of myself, of the specific shape of my vulnerability, the exact point where the wiring that made me a good fire chief became the wiring that made me a less careful man. Knowing the shape of your vulnerability is not the same as being free of it, but it's the beginning of being smarter about it. I'm 71 years old. I ran into fires for 40 years. I gave $420,000 to a woman in Cebu and came home with less money and more self-knowledge than I left with. Some days that trade feels reasonable. Most days I drink my coffee and look out at the Houston morning and think about what Patrice said, that the caring isn't a flaw, that it just needed a better structure. She was right, she usually is. I'm working on the structure.